You've probably heard the phrase, the Victorian era, the good old England, or Pax Britannica, the period when Britain reached the height of its global power, ruling the seas, finishing its industrial revolution, and standing unquestionably as the world's leading power. That era is inseparable from the name of one woman, Queen Victoria. Victoria is usually pictured as a somber older woman, dressed permanently in black, mourning her husband. But that image only captures the later decades of a long life. She wasn't even supposed to become queen. She was born on May 24, 1819, and only inherited the throne because everyone ahead of her in the line of succession died first. She was crowned in 1837. According to a well-known anecdote, when young Victoria was told she would become queen and asked what that would require of her, she was simply told she would need to be a good queen, and she reportedly replied that she would try to be good. That phrase stayed with her for the rest of her life. Tsar Alexander I of Russia was one of her godfathers, a largely symbolic honor, but a meaningful one. Victoria was born just 6 years after Napoleon's defeat, and Russia, having led the anti-Napoleonic coalition, was at that time the preeminent European power, making an association with its emperor politically significant. By the time Victoria became queen, the British monarchy held nowhere near the direct political power of, say, the Russian autocracy, where the Tsar remained the effective, absolute owner of the state until 1917. English monarchy had been constrained by the nobility and Parliament ever since the Magna Carta, and had passed through further upheaval since. The execution of Charles I under Oliver Cromwell, and later the Glorious Revolution that brought a new line to the throne. By Victoria's time, the crown carried ceremonial, not political weight. In that sense, Victoria became a crucial figure in what historians call Pax Britannica, not as a political actor, but as a kind of moral anchor for the era and the empire. It was during her reign that British elite society came to genuinely embrace the monarchy as a valued institution, and much of the credit for that belongs to Victoria herself. Contemporaries described her as a lively young woman who loved music and literature, though her literary tastes were fairly middlebrow. Charles Dickens, after reading her diaries, made some pointed comments about her writing. The dour, mournful widow image that later defined her wasn't always accurate. Before her first pregnancy, she reportedly smoked opium occasionally, and pipes associated with her survive in a British museum. As a young woman, she was said to have chewed coca leaves, alongside a young Winston Churchill, the future Prime Minister. She also used opium tincture as a sleep aid for headaches, but stopped once she began having children. She loved balls and enjoyed socializing. She understood early that she would have no real influence over domestic or foreign policy. Prime ministers reported to her, and she could express displeasure or concern, but nothing more binding than that. It was, at the time, a uniquely British arrangement, one that would persist for much of the following century. The monarch expressing polite concern, the prime minister politely acknowledging it, with no real obligation attached. Her coronation was, by most accounts, poorly organized. The ring prepared for the ceremony didn't fit and had to be forced onto her finger, which swelled painfully afterward. Her full given name, Alexandrina Victoria, the first name honoring her Russian godfather, was spoken publicly for the only time at that ceremony and rarely used again in official documents. The coronation's disorganization eventually led to the creation of a dedicated institution responsible for planning royal ceremonies down to the minute, the system still in use today. A year after her coronation, the future Tsar Alexander II of Russia visited England, and the two young royals reportedly took a strong liking to each other. Walks, long conversations, even rumors of romantic feeling. The match never happened. According to one account, Alexander's father, Nicholas I, dismissed the idea, saying Russia needed a Russian Tsar, not the husband of the English Queen. Victoria nonetheless retained a certain fondness for Russia afterward, one that would sour considerably by the time of the Crimean War. Her family soon began searching for a husband, and found one in her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, famously handsome. She proposed to him. Protocol required the Queen to propose, not the other way around, and they married in 1840. She loved him devotedly for the rest of his life. Victoria and Albert were enthusiastic travelers, particularly fond of Scotland, and their visits contributed to a broader rise in the popularity of Scottish culture and Scotch whisky during this period. They eventually built Balmoral Castle to be closer to the region they loved. In 1840, the world's first postage stamp, the penny black, was issued, bearing Victoria's image. Over 70 million letters were sent using it within its first year, a landmark moment still celebrated by stamp collectors today. Handsome as he was, Albert had essentially no formal political role, since the Queen herself had none to share with him. The one real clash between Victoria and Parliament in her entire reign was over securing him the title of Prince Consort, giving him at least symbolic standing, achieved eventually through her persistent lobbying. He tried to involve himself in state affairs, but had little real success, given how the British system was and remains structured. Perhaps his most lasting achievement was organizing the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, a World's Fair visited by roughly 6 million people, showcasing everything from agricultural advances to steam engines. Britain had real cause for confidence. In 1838, the first modern railway line, London to Birmingham, opened, early in the era of steam, when most of the world's ships were still built of wood with no engines at all. Britain's railway network expanded rapidly. One often cited historical comparison notes that Russia abolished serfdom in 1861, the same year the London Underground opened, illustrating just how far ahead British infrastructure had raced. Britain sat at the height of its economic power, its middle class and trade both expanding rapidly, generating enormous wealth substantially through colonial extraction. India, above all, called the jewel in the crown, contributed enormously through resource extraction. As transport, steel, and coal demand all grew together, and British goods set the global quality standard, the Bank of England became a dominant force in global finance, while free trade legislation allowed British corporations to grow into some of the world's first true multinational companies. It's worth noting that the science fiction subgenre of steampunk, imagining an alternate world built entirely on steam technology, draws directly on the aesthetic and industrial imagination of this era, even though the genre itself only emerged in the 1960s to 70s. British capital and goods spread globally. This is the essence of Pax Britannica, a world increasingly conducted in English, whether through military force, economic pressure, or diplomacy. A frequently made, if debatable, comparison holds that British colonial withdrawal, unlike some other European powers, tended to leave behind functioning courts and some form of parliamentary structure, whereas other departing colonial powers sometimes left considerably less institutional continuity behind. Britain's colonial expansion and prosperity both peaked squarely during Victoria's reign. Victoria and Albert were popular, and their partnership was genuinely admired. But the "everyone was happy" image of the era is misleading. Mid-19th century London held extraordinary wealth among the aristocracy and bourgeoisie, alongside grinding poverty for much of the working and lower classes. Child labor in factories was entirely unremarkable at the time. Women had almost no legal rights. In divorce, children were awarded to the father, and women couldn't vote, conditions that would give rise, by the century's end, to the suffragette movement and eventually the broader feminist movement. Homelessness was severe, and London's Salvation Army ran shelters graded by price. A penny bought a warm seat on a bench for the night. 2 pence, a bench with a rope strung across to lean on. 4 pence, an actual wooden box with a canvas cover, grimly nicknamed the coffin. Despite the empire's wealth, English food remained notoriously poor by European standards, a reputation that reportedly persisted well into the late 20th century, a striking contrast to neighboring France. By the mid-19th century, electric lighting was becoming common in London households, well ahead of most world capitals, a fashion partly credited to Victoria herself, even as candles remained standard in Parliament, and clerks still copied parliamentary reports by hand with quill pens, even as typewriters began appearing by century's end. Victoria understood the power of image. Her white wedding dress became the template for bridal fashion, spawning entire publications devoted to the subject. When her son nearly died of typhoid and then recovered, she rode with him in an open carriage through the streets, publicly kissing his hand, visibly moving the watching crowds. Genuine emotion, deliberately and effectively staged. Though privately mocked by more sophisticated circles as somewhat provincial and middlebrow in taste, she became, in a real sense, the emotional glue holding together a British society that increasingly saw the monarchy as a moral rather than political institution, a genuinely novel development for the English crown. Victoria also enjoyed painting, horseback riding, opera, and had a particular love of perfume and fine grooming at court. Victoria's reign was relatively free of major wars for Britain directly. Its conflicts were largely fought at the empire's periphery. The one major war against a serious rival power was the Crimean War. Beyond that, Britain conducted a long series of smaller colonial campaigns across Africa, Asia, and Oceania, almost uniformly successful thanks to superior weapons, technology, organization, and a ruthlessness historians have noted repeatedly. Concentration camps, often associated later with 20th century atrocities, were in fact first used by the British during the Second Boer War in South Africa. During the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, captured rebels were reportedly tied to cannons and executed by firing. British colonial policy showed little regard for non-British lives. The imperial rhetoric of the white man's burden, later immortalized by Kipling, framed this as a civilizing mission even as it extracted enormous wealth and met resistance with severe force. Colonial holdings expanded substantially under Victoria. Gibraltar, Cyprus, Ireland, still under occupation with the Irish question unresolved to this day, territories across Africa, including present-day Kenya, Nigeria, Somalia, and the Transvaal region of modern South Africa, along with India, Burma, Pakistan, New Guinea, New Zealand, and southern Australia. By the century's end, Britain held roughly 50 colonies and several self-governing dominions, which would later form the foundation of the British Commonwealth. Britain's foreign policy famously avoided formal alliances, relying instead on naval and economic dominance. France had been defeated, with considerable Russian help. Early in the century, Germany remained fragmented until mid-century, and Russia, its main remaining rival, was geographically distant, with friction concentrated mainly around Iran and Afghanistan, a region Britain fought 2 wars over, concluding in 1842 and 1878, without ever achieving lasting control, as local tribes continued resisting regardless of nominal British victories. Britain's opium trade with China caused catastrophic addiction rates there. When China resisted, 2 opium wars followed, both won decisively by Britain, resulting in Hong Kong becoming a British possession by the century's end. Burma was conquered across 2 wars. Egypt and Sudan were effectively absorbed into the empire. Somaliland, along with present-day Zambia and Zimbabwe, were fully annexed. Canada was also colonized during this period. British influence extended into nearly every part of the globe. Victoria was famously associated with strict public morality. The term Victorian morality survives specifically because of this association. She and Albert had 9 children, a notably fertile marriage. But Victorian morality, candidly, amounted to a fairly severe hypocrisy. Sexual matters were treated as shameful, to the point that even referring to a leg or arm was considered indelicate in polite company. Limb was the preferred euphemism, since exposed body parts were thought capable of stirring inappropriate impulses. Men were assumed to be driven by uncontrollable passions that women were expected to discourage, sex being acceptable only for procreation, with headaches serving as a standard, unofficially sanctioned excuse to decline. Naturally, high society's actual behavior diverged sharply from this public morality. Husbands who wouldn't dare brush a wife's bare wrist at dinner routinely visited brothels, kept mistresses, and fathered illegitimate children. When public morality declares sex fundamentally shameful, it tends to produce exactly this kind of double life, rather than actual restraint. Women had virtually no rights in this system, and sexual minorities had none at all. Homosexuality was a criminal offense. Oscar Wilde, one of the era's most celebrated literary figures, and London's leading arbiter of style, became one of its most prominent casualties, exposed, prosecuted, and imprisoned for his sexuality, his health permanently damaged. He died in France shortly after his release. The Old England, real gentlemen and real ladies image of the era, in other words, obscures a great deal. Even Victoria's own eldest son and eventual successor was known for private indulgences, including custom furnishings, reportedly built for that purpose in Paris. People generally found ways around the moral code they publicly upheld. Victoria's own life wasn't without danger. She survived roughly 6 assassination attempts over her reign, including a shooting on Piccadilly and 2 separate cane attacks to the head. Being a European monarch in the 19th century carried real risk. Lincoln was assassinated in America, and Tsar Alexander II, the man Victoria might once have married, was killed by a bomb in St. Petersburg, an event that reportedly shook her deeply when she learned of it. Victoria's marriage to Albert lasted about 20 years before his sudden death. He was only in his mid-40s, and the exact cause remains uncertain to this day. Some contemporaries privately blamed his declining health on years of being kept at arm's length from real influence. After his death in 1861, Victoria wore black mourning dress for the rest of her life, kept his bedroom prepared nightly as though he were still alive, and slept with a plaster cast of his hand. Royal Albert Hall and the Victoria and Albert Museum both stand today as monuments to this devotion. She devoted much of the remainder of her life to memorializing him, a public display of grief that, if anything, further endeared her to the British public, who saw in it something relatable, even amid the era's wars and economic upheavals. After Albert's death, Victoria reportedly retreated for long periods to her Scottish estate, developing a deep fondness for Scottish culture, dancing, bagpipes, and by some accounts, a taste for port. It was during this period that John Brown, a robust Scottish estate servant, became an increasingly close companion, first as a riding and hunting instructor, later occupying a far closer, more constant role at court, reportedly including séances meant to contact Albert's spirit. Public gossip about the nature of their relationship persisted, but broad public sentiment remained largely forgiving. Brown remained close to Victoria for roughly the rest of his life, and Scots reportedly remembered her fondly as unusually attuned to their culture compared to other English monarchs. Roughly 3 years before Albert's death, Britain fought and won the Crimean War against Russia, a major defeat for the Russian Empire, achieved largely through British and French technological and organizational superiority. This conflict, along with her earlier personal history, is often cited as the point where Victoria's private feelings toward Russia shifted decisively negative. The balaclava, the knitted head covering, takes its name from this war, either from mining-style helmets sent to cold British troops or from repurposed wool stockings. The garment's name has endured ever since. The Victorian era coincided with a genuine flowering of English literature and art. The pre-Raphaelite painters, along with writers including Charles Dickens, Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, the Bronte sisters, and Rudyard Kipling. A long stretch without major war or serious domestic upheaval, combined with strong economic growth, tends to favor this kind of cultural flourishing, and Victorian literature of the period is generally associated with a strong romantic sensibility. As global travel expanded, London absorbed influences from across the empire. Homes decorated in mixed styles, borrowing from China, Japan, and India room by room, heavy use of gilding and dark polished wood, and extensive display of hunting trophies reflecting the era's fondness for the sport. India, in particular, became the era's dominant cultural influence. Indian restaurants in England are still sometimes called simply curry houses, and having Indian household staff became a mark of fashionable status. Victoria herself once wrote to her daughter about meeting a visiting Persian Shah covered in jewels, noting with satisfaction that her own were still finer, a small but telling assertion of imperial standing. By the century's later years, Victoria formally added the title Empress of India to her royal styling, a largely symbolic gesture engineered by Prime Minister Disraeli, reportedly to soften her irritation that her own daughter, married into the Prussian royal family, stood to become an empress while she remained merely a queen. John Brown died in 1883, after roughly 2 decades close to the Queen. Later in life, Victoria developed a close relationship with Abdul Karim, an Indian attendant who introduced Indian cuisine to the royal household and spent considerable time with her. again prompting rumors, again without confirmation, and this final companionship helped popularize Indian food and household staff as a broader London fashion, with curry houses remaining associated with quality dining in Britain to this day. In her final years, Victoria grew heavier, ate large late-night meals, and appeared in public less frequently, even attempting, without much success, to learn some Hindi. By this point, she had become less a political figure than a living symbol of the British Empire. Her image appeared on stamps and street names throughout the colonies. Yet the empire itself was already approaching its historical peak. Germany's rise as a new industrial and military rival was accelerating toward the confrontation that would define the early 20th century, while the United States and industrializing Russia added further competitive pressure. British industrial growth slowed relative to newer competitors. Agricultural production declined sharply. By the century's end, over 80% of the population lived in cities, many of them displaced former farmers, and economic hardship fueled the rise of labor movements and the earliest labor political organizing, setting the stage for the political struggles of the following century. Three developments during Victoria's reign, unrelated to her directly, but historically significant. In November 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a work that would generate lasting conflict with religious institutions and reshape biology, geography, and botany. On December 24, 1853, England enacted a law making childhood smallpox vaccination compulsory, the origin of the modern vaccination program, still the subject of debate today. And in the autumn of 1888, an unidentified killer murdered several women in London's East End, becoming known to history as Jack the Ripper, a case never definitively solved. Victoria planned her own funeral in considerable detail. Per her instructions, she was buried with Albert's dressing gown and a photograph of him in one hand, and in the other, a photograph and a lock of hair belonging to John Brown, along with a favored ring, a final quiet reconciliation of the two men she'd loved most. She died on the Isle of Wight at 81, having reigned longer than any English monarch before her, the defining figure of an era permanently remembered as the good old days of England. The Victorian era left behind the near absence of major wars, a stabilized and industrialized economy, the definitive shift to rail transport, the first horse-drawn omnibuses, precursors to the double-decker bus, the telegraph, and a merchant fleet that transitioned almost entirely from sail to steel and steam. It produced the first true multinational corporations and made British banks the world's dominant financial institutions. It also hardened Britain's class divide to its sharpest point, a stratification between aristocracy, a wealthy bourgeoisie, and enormous persistent poverty that in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and London would remain visible for generations. Charles Dickens, one of the era's defining writers, offered perhaps the era's best epitaph. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness.